You'll go to hell if you've lived in sin. So say your prayers, 'cause here comes Grim.
Hello lovelies, I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff. Please like, subscribe, and most important of all, share, so that people can discover me and all the wonders that I offer. Hello lovelies. In my recent gaming reviews, I haven't particularly felt the need to go really deep into it, because these have been older books that have been out for a while. Everyone has some kind of idea of what's in them. Today, however, I am reviewing Tasha's Cauldron of Everything for Dungeons & Dragons, and it's a new book, and so I think it bears a much deeper treatment. So this is going to go on for a lot longer than I normally would in a game review. Is there anything to say beforehand? It's a little thin. It's pretty much what you'd expect from a Dungeons & Dragons release, and it's really a grab bag of anything and everything that would normally probably have been published as articles in a magazine back in the old days. So there's good, there's bad, there's indifferent, and there are issues that it raises, I think. By far and away, the biggest section in this book are the character options. It's very player focused overall, but particularly this section. Now, this is probably going to be the most controversial part of the book within the gaming community, but they're making race, more properly called species, virtually irrelevant, as they're now allowing you to swap in and out ability increases, languages, proficiencies, and so on. You can even change your character's size, so you could play a giant halfling, for example, which might make some of their other capabilities make a lot less sense than they do currently. This is all tied into this weird idea that fantasy races, which again are really more like species, somehow reflects on reality and people's attitude to real world races. On the one hand, if that was the problem, the way to tackle it would be to leave it completely open, but because we're not talking about real world races, and because we're talking about different species or subspecies, eliminating the particular traits that they have makes no sense on a plausibility level, and yes, even D&D has its own internal plausibility, and also removes the point of having all of these different options, which is they have tendencies in certain ways and so on. And the fun of playing a character that bucks against that trend, which you can already do when you assign your statistics, the choices that you make, the way that you develop the character, the fun of playing a character that bucks the standard, the stereotype, is in that stereotype existing in the first place. You can look at, say, for example, the forensic doctor dwarf in Terry Pratchett's books, who's a female dwarf but shaves off her beard, starts wearing makeup, wears high-heeled iron boots, things like that, but is still a dwarf. And the fun is in bucking against the dwarven culture that exists and the confusion on gender that exists within dwarven culture, because they all grow beards and they all present as male. So this removes a lot of that. It feels like a sop and appeasement. And how you run your own game is, of course, up to you, but the official books create the expectations and the demands, particularly if you're playing outside your home group in conventions, game stores and so on, when those all start up again, of course. But increasingly this kind of gatekeeping is also happening with online games. So if you're looking to pick up a game of D&D online over Zoom or whatever, while the pandemic carries on until the vaccine's rolled out, these expectations also come in there. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it removes the specialness and the meaningfulness of the choices that you make. There's a new class, new-ish, the Artificer, which obviously originally comes from Eberron. There have been playtest kits with that out, and this is the finalized version. I couldn't spot any huge glaring differences between this one and the earlier playtest versions, but it's nice to have a new class that's more sort of steampunk or magipunk oriented. For the barbarians and for all the other classes, you get alternate class features. So when you get to a certain level and you would normally get a class feature, you can instead swap in one of these alternates. It's a nice way to go about it, but it's a lot to keep track of. This is why I prefer open character generation rather than class and level systems, but hey, there you go. Barbarians also get new subclasses, the Path of the Beast, where you essentially are a were creature. Similar to Tolkien's Bear Men, I suppose, and the Path of Wild Magic, where magic just kind of comes off you in wild and crazy ways when you frenzy. It's okay, it's not special, could have done with something a bit more traditional and low-key, I think, as different versions. Or something like a barbarian with a Zen focus, something like that, or a juggernaut ability to shrug off damage more so than ordinary barbarians. Yeah, things like that. So yeah, it's okay. Bards, you get new colleges, as well as the swap-ins. You get College of Creation and College of Eloquence. Eloquence is pretty self-explanatory. The College of Creation at higher levels will essentially allow you to become a living Disney cartoon, as when you sing and perform, you can animate objects around yourself. So if you want to sing a duet with a teapot, that's the subclass to take. Clerics get swaps and domains primarily. There's nothing particularly new to talk about there. A little bit dull. Druids get swaps again. There are new circles: Circle of Spores, Circle of Stars, Circle of Wildfire. I can see the Circle of Spores being very useful as a guideline when you're creating NPCs, like a Myconid mage, or a druid, or whatever else. Just with a different alternative look. Or if you're running an Underdark campaign, then the Circle of Spores obviously makes a lot more sense than a lot of other druids. Fighters, again, have swap traits. They have additional maneuvers and fighting styles. Subclasses, you have the Psi Warrior, who uses psychic capabilities, the Rune Knight, who inscribes runes. Why would that just be limited to one subclass of fighter? You know, runes should be a different kind of magic, maybe accessible through a feat, but you know, that's how they do it here. They offer various builds for the Battle Master. Monks, again, same thing, swaps, traditions, mercy, which is a sort of a less effectual healer version of the monk, and the astral self, who is much more concerned with energy and spiritual realms and so on. Paladins have swaps, additional fighting styles. Oath of Glory, which is you're destined to do something amazing for your god. And Oath of the Watchers, where you take an oath to guard and protect a certain realm or whatever. If you take that broad to mean the realm or the plane of existence, that works. If you take it more narrowly, it's going to render a character unable to travel particularly well. Rangers, again, you've got swapped class traits. More fighting style options, new archetypes: the Fey Wanderer, who spends a lot of time in the Fairylands; the Swarm Keeper, which is a Beastmaster who looks after swarms of bees, wasps, hornets, whatever else it might be. New options for Beastmasters, which is all very welcome. I would like to see a non-magical Ranger class, but that's just me again. The Rogue has a single swap, which essentially makes them into a sniper of sorts. They have new archetypes: the Phantom, which is a sort of necromantic thief/assassin, and the Soul Knife, which is a psionic stabby person. The Sorcerer has new spells, new meta magic, new origins: aberrant source of magic, psionic source of magic, and a sort of clockwork, otherworldly source of magic. The Warlock gets swaps again, more spells, different pact boons, new invocations, new patrons: Fathomless, which is some kind of hugely powerful water elemental, or you could take it in a more Cthulhuid vein, I'm sure, if you wanted to, and Genies, which was a little odd, but then I guess if you wished for the capability to cast magic from a noble genie that you rescued, that would make some sort of sense. The Wizard is one of the more interesting ones. New spells, a few swaps, But they have arcane traditions. Now, the arcane traditions used to be the schools of magic, evocation, abjuration, and so on. So there's an opening here in which we could bring back in the different schools of magic as wizard subclasses, essentially. But it's not here. What you do have is blade slinging, which is a magic user who's also capable with a sword and can use the sword to invoke and use magic, and scribes, which lets you do additional things with scrolls and spell books and so on. And it's probably the one I think is the best thematically out of the lot. There's a couple of handfuls of new feats. Hardly anyone ever seems to take feats in 5th edition, which is a bit weird because they were such an integral part of 3rd edition and such a customizable part of 3rd edition. You'd think they'd feature more. They feature more prominently in 5th edition because they are pretty good for the most part. But I think the problem is that they create a hyper specialization that a lot of players don't necessarily want, and boosting your stats instead, because feats give you a lesser boost to your stats and some special capabilities, but boosting your stats makes you all round more competent. I think few people are willing to sacrifice that stat increase for the feats. So while it's welcome to see more of them, I'm just not convinced that they're going to see a great deal of use. It kind of hangs around over 5th edition without really seeming to be used very much. Your mileage may vary, but in any game of 5th edition D&D I've observed, played in, or DM'd for, feats just don't get used. And it's worth pausing here for a moment on the psionics part, because psionics is something that a lot of people have been waiting for. But this isn't really psionics rules. There's no psion, there's no psi lists of capabilities. There are just subclasses and options that kind of shift towards psionics. And if they're not bringing out a Dark Sun book, I wouldn't hold out too much hope of seeing any of the more specialist psionic stuff. So it was rather underwhelming. Nice to see. I don't like psionics particularly in my D&D games, apart from Dark Sun. Yeah, it was nice to see, but underwhelming is the word. Group Patrons is another new addition, and it's nice. It's helpful to the games master. I think it's helpful for the players in coming up with a concept for their group. But it's another case where 5th edition is adding stuff, adding advantages and options and so on to players without rebalancing. It's always nice to have an alternative option to you all meet in a tavern and a kindly wizard offers you a quest. It's always pleasant to have that, and it's nice to have mechanics and hooks around which to structure the group. I think in most games these days, if it's a regular group, you come to some kind of accommodation around how your group has come together. And in lots of games, a group is a default, like a team of superheroes or a coterie in Vampire. Those sorts of things. The idea of a group of 4 to 6 players is kind of baked into the concept, which it's quite nice. It encourages you and enables you to put things together in a bit more of an effective way. So this is nice, but most groups already do it. But this gives advantages. You can give advantage to another member of the group on a roll once per long rest. That can be quite effective. You get perks for affiliation. Different groups might give you different capabilities, like an academy might be able to provide you with researchers who can look into a subject or solve a puzzle for you over the course of time, and so on. There are plenty of different subtypes and options within each of the ideas that they present, and it's easily customizable to your own choices. Like, there are guilds, but there is no adventurers guild, which is something that a lot of people put into their games. So that could be something you could add in as quest givers and create mechanics for. Groups or people to whom you owe your allegiance are very useful for giving quests and missions too, if you want to create a more mission oriented rather than a more free roaming form of game. And so having the group mechanics there is useful for that. But the advantages, and this is something I'm seeing across a lot of these releases for D&D as I review them, it just doesn't balance anymore. You keep piling on these options and advantages and ways to specialize and cheese the rules and to create obscene character builds, which is a problem that plagued 3rd edition, without offering guidelines to rebalance the game. Now, balance is often for pussies, but if you want to take on a Tarrasque at level 1, fill your boots. But it is a helpful guide when creating published adventures and so on, where you want to try and target the difficulty at the right sort of level and reward cunning and so on. But all of these new advantages, and this includes group patrons, really throws it off, unfortunately. And I'm not quite sure, I haven't delved deep enough into the mathematics, and I shouldn't have to figure out how to rebalance encounters to take into account all of these new options, advantages, and so on. Magic. There's not a great deal to be said here. It's nice to have a bunch of new spells, official spells. Every bit of information is useful if you're creating your own spells or introducing new spells into your campaigns, and many of these seem quite useful. None of them are hugely remarkable, but they're all a welcome addition. There are some rules for some small customizations and personalizations of magic if you want to adapt your various spells in various ways, something I've already been doing. It's easy enough to knock a bit off range, add a bit to radius, vice versa, change the damage type, whatever it might be. So it's easy enough to customize already, but it's nice to have a few little sort of guidelines on that sort of thing, though they're mostly cosmetic in the rules here. There are plenty of magical items, including magical tattoos and so on, which might appeal for monk characters and so on. Standout magic items: implantable magic teeth, which grant certain special abilities and can be used in a variety of different ways. And the magical tomes are a lot more interesting. The specialized spell books and so on are a lot more interesting in the magic items. The one really standout thing, I think, within the new magic is the improvement in the summoning rules. Summoners used to be a really kind of interesting build in 3rd edition and so on for your magic users, in that they could summon allies who would battle for you and either get dispelled or fade back into whatever plane or magical ephemera that they were created from. 5th edition did away with a lot of summoning except for really minor summoning effects. This brings some of the summoning back, though you won't be summoning the actual creatures, rather you summon a sort of standardized subversion of a ghost or a demon or whatever else it might be. So it's welcome, but it's just not quite as satisfying as the older versions of summoning magic were. No sexy succubi for you. Dungeon Master's Tools is the last big section. They talk about Session 0, which is quite fashionable, but I think most people do that already, or you're joining an existing game that already has a group and a theme and all the rest of it. So, it's not something that really needs to be covered particularly. It provides a few aids and ideas for how your party might have come together. Again, this is something you can thrash out for yourself, but it's nice to have a few points of inspiration there. Some tips on running games for single players involving the sort of sidekick mechanics, which they introduce here. The implicit social contract between the Dungeon Master and the players is made explicit rather than implicit in this book, but everyone's social contract is different, so I am concerned that new players, newish players, certain types of players will refer to the DM player social contract in this book as if it were a writ of law, rather than leaving it implicit and unspoken between the players and the games master, which I think is the defining factor of a social contract, that it's implicit and it's kind of arrived at by consensus. Maybe that's my anarchistic tendencies talking, whereas having it explicitly written out here makes it vulnerable to abuse, misuse, and other issues. They also go on to talk about hard and soft limits. Now, most D&D games, Erotech notwithstanding, most games are not centered around sex or BDSM. And if you're running a game that is centered around something triggering, such as horror, then that's part of the implicit social contract that you make when you go into the game. You know, this game is meant to be scary, frightening, disgusting, violent, whatever. You know, that's the point, that's the fun of it. So setting hard and soft limits, it's just another sop to this shrieking crowd of funless sirens constantly going off around every hobby at the moment. You don't need it. You know, you are ultimately in control. You can leave the table. You can block your ears. You can pass your character off to someone else to play for you during the scene that you don't like and step outside for a cigarette or whatever else. You don't need this, but by putting the explicit social contract and by putting hard soft limits and all but going to the X card within the book, it gives it an air of authority and officialdom and shapes expectations again for those new and newer players and the shrieking joy vacuums that like to insert themselves into everything. So it concerns me, and it concerns me in every game that it's put in, and it seems to be every game from a top or middle tier publisher these days has these sorts of things in them, and they're unnecessary. They get in the way, they can kill roleplay, they can kill games, they can break up groups. Take responsibility for yourself, god damn it, and for the other people at the table who you might be disrupting when you invoke things like this, and the GM's hard work, which should be respected. They do supply some quick rules for sidekick characters. So if your party adopts the kobold, which they are wont to do, unfortunately, in many games, then there's a quick and easy way of incorporating that into the game and having them level up along with the characters, so long as they survive. There's an expert NPC class with a little modification. There's few additions, few changes that can very easily be used to create a non-magical, scholarly, or whatever player character class. It's too combat focused in the book, which says a lot, I suppose. So you've got NPC classes for the expert, which is rather generic, spellcaster, and warrior. Is a rogue, is a thief an expert if you take one of those on as a sidekick? I don't know. Sidekicks are meant to be less powerful than PCs, which is why I suggest if you use these for player characters, you should bump them up a bit. A proper spellcasting class or a proper warrior class, but the expert with a little modification could definitely be a new PC class. Ideas for parlaying with monsters, which reflects how the shrieking joy vacuums have have changed the nature of the game. I think wanting non-violent options is good, but again it lends it this sense of authority and creates expectations, which isn't necessarily so good. There are a bunch of rules and ideas and options for environments, but here we're talking about weird magical environments infested with horrific insects or shaped by magic, mirror realms, things like that. Useful inspiration, it's not bad. There's a section on puzzles, but it doesn't really provide much in the way of generic advice, and instead is structured around a bunch of examples which everyone is now going to know and everyone is now going to use, and so they're not going to be much of a puzzle for anybody anymore. So, nah. So, at the end of all that, what do I think of Tasha's Cauldron of Everything? It's a disjointed Frankenstein mess of a book, but I don't mind that. There's lots of good and interesting ideas. There's some other things which I would say are causes for concern to the wider hobby and other nerd hobbies, probably. Giving authority and credence to very particular, very minority styles of play and expectations from play is going to be caustic to the hobby as a whole, ironically, in the name of inclusion, I think, and eliminating the meaningfulness of choice when it comes to your character's species. I prefer, if you like, a multicultural approach where you incorporate many different species and races and so on, rather than an assimilationist approach where everything ends up as this homogeneous, undifferentiated blob of grey, which is what the rules here would say. Of course, you don't have to include any of this, but increasingly it's going to take a strong-minded group and a strong-minded dungeon master not to go along with the shrieking joy vacuums. So that's concern. I mentioned the rebalancing problem. As I said, in a lot of these books, and probably especially this one, the increased options, there is no way a dungeon master could learn everything from every book anymore, and so you have to rely on and trust players to interpret things correctly. That can have problems around trust issues. The increased powers and so on, group patrons, piety in Theros, things like that, they unbalance the game further in favour of the players in a game that is already probably gauged too easy, and there are no rules or suggestions on how to rebalance encounters and so on if you're using all of these. So how far should I increase my XP budget if they've got a group patron, if they're using piety from Theros, all of these other aspects? There's just no real guidance on how to do that. I would say probably, depending how many options, you probably want to consider the character level to be perhaps 1, maybe even 2 higher if they've got a load of these options piled on, and then create the encounters according to that adjusted statistic. But I don't really know, and that's a problem. I also think it's getting to be a massive problem that they haven't updated the SRD in a long time. That's the open content, that's the open version of all the rules. We need more open content to riff off. And by not releasing this stuff, we're forced, if we're publishers particularly, to be very careful and wary, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, to blatantly and openly rip off the content by reskinning it with different wording, because you can't copyright mechanics, you can only copyright their expression. So it's not a comfortable place to be in as a publisher, as a creator of third-party content. So the scores, which is what you're all here for, I am sure. Style, 4, competent, workmanlike, everything we've come to expect from D&D, but nothing exceptional. Substance, I mean, it's scattershot, but there's a lot in it. I would give it a 5 for substance, but I am extremely concerned about some of the substance, and some of the changes in the book take away from the substance of the game preceding this publication. Particularly there, I'm thinking about the races. It's disappointing that the Scion stuff wasn't really explored in a better way, so I can't really give it more than a 4 for substance. So, 4 for style, 4 for substance, 8 out of 10. Worth a punt if you play D&D on the regular, but be cautious with it. Zang. Postmortem Studios sells a wide variety of stock art, well over 500 pieces, many of them by RPG industry veteran Brad McDevitt. These are available for you to use in your personal or professional projects, whether stories or games or anything else. Check us out at rpgnow.com. Ladies and gentlemen, a single bottle of Reverend Dr. Grimm's Miracle Elixir will solve your constipation, dissipation, exculpation, obstipation, extirpation, bastardization, demoralization, amortization, accusation, disorganization, bowdlerization, malversation, dehumanization, plagiarization, demonization, feminization, localization, categorization, stigmatization, monetization, pulverization, rationalization, sterilization, victimization, infatuation, insinuation, vexation, masturbation, perturbation, litigation, subjugation, and the French pox, or your money back, as used by the crowned heads of Europe.